أهلا وسهلا بكم مجددا إلى ندوة الفلسفة والجائحة والمرض. نبدأ الجلسة الثالثة وهي تحوي المحاضرة العامة تلقيها البروفيسورة Marie-Hélène Parizeau. C'est mon plaisir de vous accueillir chez nous, Marie-Hélène, à l'Institut du Doha. Je vais faire l'introduction en arabe maintenant. دكتورة ماري-هيلين باريزو هي أستاذة الفلسفة الأخلاقية في جامعة لافال بكندا. درست البيولوجيا والفلسفة في جامعة مونتريال في كندا قبل أن تواصل دراستها للفلسفة في باريس، حيث حصلت على الدكتوراه في الفلسفة، وهي عضو اللجنة العالمية لأخلاقيات المعرفة العلمية والتكنولوجيا في منظمة الأمم المتحدة للتربية والعلم والثقافة. صدرت لها العديد من المؤلفات، منها المستشفى والأخلاق، العنصرية والانحرافات الجينية، بالاشتراك مع الدكتور سهيل القش. إعادة التفكير في الطبيعة، حوار فلسفي أوروبا آسيا أمريكا، هذا إصدار آخر. تتركز اهتماماتها البحثية في الفلسفة الأخلاقية والاجتماعية. يسرنا حضورها معنا اليوم في هذه الجلسة، وسأدعوها للبدء في محاضرتها. Marie-Hélène, c'est votre tour maintenant.
Marhaba. I would like first to thank very warmly the Doha Institute for this kind invitation, and particularly Dr. Rashid Boutayed. So the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, took the form of a worldwide outbreak, resulting in disruption of our shared world, underscoring, as Edgar Morin explained, the commonness of our destiny of all humans and every country. A single virus has shown us irrefutably our interdependence with other life forms and within Earth ecosystems. Scientists have shown how bats are a reservoir of coronavirus, and that an animal like pangolin may also have been an intermediate host. These interactive channels between animal to human transmissions call into question our current way of being in relation to wild and domesticated animals, and more broadly, our relation of interdependence within the natural environment. Has the pandemic compelled us to appreciate this dual interdependence at a collective and global level? Only time will tell. In any case, we have managed easily enough to measure old and new forms of social, economic, cultural, and political vulnerabilities. These are the topics of this lecture. Vulnerability is to be understood in this context as fragility and insecurity, whether it concerns individuals and institutions within our modern technological civilization. Vulnerability is reflected in social isolation and marginalization of individual groups who are neglected and made socially invisible. These people consequently must depend on other kinds of support, solidarity, and care other than state institutions to face their difficulties and meet their basic needs. The concept of modern technological civilization encompasses, on one hand, Heidegger's idea of the essence of technology that reveals nature and humanity as a resource, un fait, and on the other hand, Jacques Ellul's idea of technology that appears as a system through its characteristic and figures as a dominating force. In other words, did the pandemic shows us our modern technological society's vulnerability, changing some of its logic and values? This question formed the basis of the present inquiry, which aim to identify past and new vulnerabilities within our society, actualized by the pandemic. First, I will clarify the philosophical concept of vulnerability with the ethic of care. And next, I will explain some characteristics of the technological system of Jacques Ellul. Then I will examine, in turn, the different forms of institutional and social vulnerability that have arisen as a result of the pandemic, especially in modern Western nations, by relating them back to certain features of Ellul's technological system. So, vulnerability. Vulnerability is a recurrent theme in contemporary ethics. In the late 1970s, for example, Hans Jonas connected it to an imperative of responsibility toward the fragility of the phenomena of life. Nature, including also human beings, are vulnerable to human technological intervention. Moral responsibility with the same kind of parental care, caring for one's vulnerable child, should be applied to control all technological risks of modernity and should take into account future generations. In the face of modern technology, say Hans Jonas, the world, nature, human beings, all of us are becoming vulnerable. In the 1990s, other more radical critiques were expressed concerning the excess of capitalism, globalization with the increase of social inequalities, a preoccupation with risk management and security, and forms of social marginalization. In this vein, care theories offer a distinct point of view on social vulnerability. Put succinctly, care theories offer care related to the work of care associate with moral feelings of concern and care for other members of society. This everyday caring is reflected at a social and ethical level in protecting and being responsible toward vulnerable others. Certain life practices and certain kind of work have taken care at the core of their activity, such as profession in healthcare, education, housekeeping, or home care. We will see how the COVID pandemic had led an immediate mobilization of this care profession by various states to cope with these emergency situations, revealing at the same time inequalities and power relations. Paradoxically, the pandemics had shown how modern society that claim an ideology of individualism and efficiency still rely on the foundation of interdependence of its member and on various forms of care relations. Care theories maintain that such interdependency is fundamental and foundational and correlates with vulnerability. All human beings have needs, and in the course of a lifetime, from birth to old age, with all will at time be giver and receiver of care. This insight of all humans as vulnerables open up another ethical pathway, a social and political alternative to forms of domination, as John Tronto explained, and I quote, "The process of care are complex. They involve phases of caring about, caring for, caregiving, and care receiving. They also require specific moral qualities, including attentiveness, caring about, deep reflection about responsibility, caring for, a competence in caregiving, and the responsiveness of those who receive the care receiving, along with the actual process of care itself. As a political project, care is rooted in participatory democracy and equality, where it concerns an equitable distribution within society of care responsibilities. Care, thereby, brings with it a project of social justice and distributive social goods. Theory of care challenged the way social and political institutions assign the burden of care to some, while others are discharged of them. Do such institutions respond to the need of the most vulnerable? What are these needs and how are they met? By generating more justice for all? And what about forms of discrimination or disregard in the social and political assignment of care responsibilities? We will see in the third section that the COVID pandemic has thrown glaring light on certain social injustice in connection with vulnerability, for example, that of the elderly and of those employed in care-related fields. Technological civilization. To examine some of the cause or effect of the pandemic with regard to taking care, it may be helpful to clarify certain characteristics of technological civilization. Since the phenomenon of industrialization in the 19th century, technological civilization has spread to all countries throughout the world with varying degrees of hybridization with social and political structures. It is fascinating to note how a technical logic is privileged as a means for finding solutions since the start of the pandemic. Online technological solutions, for example, were chosen and promoted by government with the financial and technological means. Businesses and public administration, for example, very quickly shift their employees to remote work to their home. Some governments have also imposed tracking apps for cell phones, monitoring citizen movement and physical contacts to trace the channel of infection. The movement toward technological solution is without doubt one of the main characteristics of technological system. And I quote, "Since it was possible, it was necessary." Really a master phrase for all technological evolution, explained Jacques Ellul. Modern technology has developed into an environment as a way of life. In this technological environment, we increasingly depend upon technology for our social and economic activities. In our everyday behavior, even psychologically, maintained Ellul, we have come to develop a dependency on technology whose demand we have internalized. Our vulnerability vis-à-vis technology is twofold. We have an increasing need for technology to maintain and develop the Western way of life, and we are increasingly more adapted to this technological world and comfort and efficiency. During the first confinement, where everything was slowed down, each person experiments their own dependency with regard to this technological environment in deep feeling of anxiety or liberation. For Heidegger, technology is the very essence of Western thought. This thought has become technology. Its materiality is the consequences of such thought. For Jacques Ellul, technique imposes itself from the outside by fragmenting the thought. Technique is already here. Beyond machine and machinery, technique has become a system that envelops us and imposes its logic. Has the COVID pandemic pierced the veil of the technological system? A slowdown of the technological system certainly has enabled several people to differentiate between basic need, food, shelter, protection from the elements and from danger, and secondary needs, pseudo needs, according to Ellul terminology, that are informed by technological means. Nevertheless, the technological system characteristics are so compelling that Ellul shows that there is no external point within modernity that could offer us a way out. There is no outside, no way of transcending it. Ellul concludes that technicized humanity decide in accordance with technology. Thus, the understanding of the grip of the technological system that encompasses modern humanity, we will need to explain briefly this technological phenomena. Autonomy is the very condition of technological development. It follows that the autonomy of technique is immediately connected to its unity. It's also universal and totalizing. It subsumes all aspects of life. As a system, its parts are closely bound up with some another and possess a common regularity. This leads to a cascade of interrelation application. Think, for example, of the cell phone and the myriad of applications. Hélène remarks that up until the end of the 20th century, the technological system was only augmenting. This movement of augmentation clearly depends on a fair number of conditions of possibility. For example, the economic forces, state policies in research and development, the ideology of technological progress, for example. In addition of this self-augmentation, technique functions in accordance with the automatism of efficiency and rational calculation, even if at the outside, nothing is fixed and various technical avenues are experimented with before one of them become established. The best technology is the one which commands an efficiency of means. This implied the adaptation of milieu of technology and the elimination of non-technological activities in favor of others. This self-augmentation of the technological system accelerates and complexifies at an unbelievable rate. This acceleration of technological progress raised the problem of forecasting or predictability. Does this expansion of the technological system have limits? Hélène's answer is concise. Imbalance and dysfunction will accelerate within the technological system, resulting in disorder for lack of feedback that will bring about a slowdown of the system. The global outbreak of the COVID pandemic might just force us to take a step back and a necessary moment of reflection. Might this step back, this moment of critical thought, have a part to play in the deceleration of the technological system if we follow Hélène? Are there new elements that we could draw from in the past 10 months of the pandemic that could light up alternative paths from this global crisis that had disrupted modern technological society? In this third part, we will now explore this question by approaching it from the angle of institutional and social vulnerabilities that have become apparent during the pandemic by attempting to understand what it is they make visible within technological civilization, as well as the openings they create. So the COVID pandemic vulnerability as the flip side of technological civilization. How has vulnerability become apparent during the COVID crisis? The picture is broad and is depicted under four main headlines that outline forms of vulnerability that you can see on the here. So first, technological forecasting and human vulnerability. It is an understatement that the COVID pandemic was unpredictable and have been experienced as an unprecedented, exceptional event since the Second World War. The pandemic swept all political calculation and economic forecasts for the year 2020. The neoliberal economic system, and especially the expanding movement of globalization, were stalled during the first confinement of the pandemic. The slowdown in economic exchange between countries has demonstrated the considerable systemic vulnerability of many countries relative to foreign supplies. Sanitary measures have highlighted most country dependence in the domain of medical equipment. The role of the states was reinforced compared with the neoliberal ideal of the minimum state by an interventionism that emerged with the start of the pandemic, with measure of social protection, stimulus policy, fiscal measure, subsidies, etc. Fragile international cooperation has exacerbated the economic vulnerability of countries for assessing sanitation equipment and vaccine in particular. Because of this, some have stressed the importance of a minimum consensus among the world nations for the common good. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization has found itself at the center of scientific controversies, the debate over chloroquine, for example, and geopolitical issues concerning the fair distribution of vaccines. Concrete management of the pandemic has had to cope with an exponential increase in the number of people infected with COVID, including hospitalization and deaths. Several Western states have employed military vocabulary: first wave, second wave, a general mobilization of the population, frontline healthcare worker, a vaccine as the ultimate weapon, the Christmas truce, etc. This rhetoric of warlike exhortation, which often goes hand in hand with the political authoritarianism of state of emergency, has been combined with the tools of technology. Despite this, many government health systems were unable to manage the first wave of COVID, since they failed to assess and fully grasp what was actually happening on the ground. Confinement measures and priorities in reopening certain sectors of society have varied from country to another. The inconsistency of certain public health directives about wearing masks, tracking strategy, or the cacophony among scientists about treatment for COVID exemplifies several institutional disorders in response to the crisis. The disaster was especially pronounced among the sick and the elderly living in long-term care facilities. The death toll and active outbreak of COVID were concentrated in these institutions, while a hospital took in patients in intensive care. Thus, during the first wave in Canada, for example, as well in European countries, roughly 80% of COVID deaths were elderly sick people in those long-term care centers. They were the true face of vulnerability in this pandemic. Media have given them a voice and have shown us the real living condition: isolation, very few contact, social contacts and cultural activities, a storage of nursing staff, etc., but also deficient administrative management that reflect a chronic underfunding of this center. An ideology of ageism has over several decades in the West helped to form negative social attitude toward aging. And by the same token, the elderly are regarded as fragile, useless, powerless, and dependent. Consequently, the elderly face social marginalization and neglect, even while the aging population in the Western countries are numerically significant. For example, in Canada, 70% of the Canadians are over 65 years old. Why did the health system and public health not anticipate what was going to happen in these long-term care centers while they knew that these facilities were vulnerable to the spread of the pandemic? Is vulnerability an administrative category? The vulnerability of the elderly in long-term care centers has remained invisible within the technological system with its automatism of efficiency and rational calculation. Moreover, the health system is constructed according to an hospital centrism that quantify medical procedure, the number of beds, the duration of hospital stay, etc. Accounting logic in a hospital focuses on what is efficient and measurable, essentially on what is technological. Thus, many caregiving action remain invisible to management: the glass of water brought to the patient, the extra blanket, the smile, informal discussion between caregivers about the patient, etc. They are no measurable and hence non-existent from an accounting standpoint. Has managing an hospital become equivalent to managing a factory? It is worth noting that in the current second wave of the pandemic, very strict confinement measures are justified by government essentially in order to safeguard the capacity of hospitals to accommodate patients infected with COVID and to assure adequate supply and available caregivers. The pandemic has therefore highlighted managerial logic within technological civilization that at the same time precipitates social vulnerability, elderly people housed in long-term care centers, and structural vulnerability, hospital centrism and its managerial accountancy. Second point, the elimination of non-technological activities. Rational and efficient calculations seek to eliminate non-technological activities, explained Jacques Ellul. Yet many dimensions of taking care fall outside the scope of technological action and activities. The education system, for example, has also suffered the brunt of the pandemic. During the first confinement period, school, college, and university were closed in many countries. With partial deconfinement, many children were sent back to school wearing masks on alternative school days with complex physical distancing rules, etc. As many parents work remotely, the issue became how to juggle the demand of work and their children's education. Sociopolitical compromise were reached, and the start of the school last September, went ahead in several countries. But from preschool education to high school, medical publication, including the very influential American Academy of Pediatrics, have maintained that in-person learning is markedly more advantageous than online education for the emotional, intellectual, and social development of children and teenagers. Teaching in university and college has taken another altogether different route, a technological route. While circumstances vary from one country to another, the overall movement with confinement has been to drastically transform in-person class to online education. What is intriguing in this deliberate choice from government and university directorate has made to harness the pandemic in order to force professors and students a switch to distance education even in 2021. This experiment, imposed without the consent of professors and students, was carried out without any prior preparation for most universities. It was given rise to already documented problems of vulnerability in studies on distance learning, and they are now greatly amplified. Access to digital technology, to basic familiarity with digital tools, are first barrier creating social inequality. Next, the material condition in which students evolve have an impact on their concentration and motivation. Access to a basic workplace, a disruptive family atmosphere, or financial worries about losing a job during the pandemic are real obstacles. The vulnerability of these students is reinforced by isolation and political invisibility, since their situation is only technologically managed. Professors, for their part, had no choice but to adapt their courses' content and care for their students in this situation where human relating was suddenly no longer central to teaching and learning. The persistent policy on online classes in university and college, as opposed to the social debate that enable a fast return to the classroom for most school children, has favored a technological way of managing university, occulting the non-technological activity that are central to university education. The pandemic has also shown how universities are structurally vulnerable. As it widely noted, the loss of foreign students who have returned in their country of origin since the start of the confinement has opened a financial drain for many private and public universities in wealthy countries. The possibility of restructuring university by increasing its number of online students and decreasing the number of teachers in favor of less qualified and less expensive teacher assistant is seen by certain administrators as an opportunity created by the pandemic. This technological imperative has manifested itself in other domains and for other living beings. I will skip here the example of the vulnerability of farm animals with the controversy in Denmark over mink farms infected with COVID. Issue of justice and vulnerability. The vulnerability of the poorest and those who suffer discrimination is a central preoccupation of the ethic of care. I will briefly consider 4 examples to illustrate certain social divides and how certain economic vulnerability have been highlighted in the wake of the pandemic. The crisis in long-term care center has cast a glaring light on working conditions for healthcare attendants. In Canada, for example, almost all these workers in both public and private sector, the majority of them are women, are in precarious situations. Mobile caregiving and in absence of protective gear resulted in the spread of the epidemic among the elderly and sick living in long-term health centers, but also among healthcare personnel. Their salary, barely over the minimum wage, reflect their underqualification since most of them have no specific training. Care workers are often recruited from among immigrant newcomers. The invisibility of this category of care worker has dissipated since government acknowledged in the first wave of the pandemic of the essential importance of their care work with sick and elderly people. These workers have become guardian angels and are publicly applauded. Provincial government in Canada intervened to raise salary, create permanent position, etc. The new social and political reevaluation of the care label was able to make up for some injustice and to affirm the fundamental role of taking care in contrast with technological acts. What emerged here was a recognition of the interdependency of members of society and of social importance of relation of care in its different institutional forms. As some author pointed out, because of the economic slowdown it engendered, the pandemic led to job loss in all economic sectors except of the digital sector, of course, highlighting the precarity and insecurity of the world's poorest. Does this shift from online office work in the richest country represent a new technological mutation in the working world? Distance working does have its positive consequences. Less travel time, more flexibility for management, increased productivity for businesses, etc. However, this change more negatively impact women, especially those with children, or women have lost their job, face a new heavy domestic and professional load, experience more stress, and are often professionally isolated. Once more.
You have about 10 minutes left.
It's okay. I'm sorry. Once more, the technological solution of distance working highlights significant inequalities and discrepancy in the living condition of men and women. As a deeper level, distant working raises a question of the meaning of work. Can work be reduced to a purely instrumental and productive logic? Isn't work also a channel among many for creating social solidarity or a sense of personal achievement? The pandemic has shown its gaze another form of work, volunteering, a collective taking care, carrying out by mass of people, often retired citizens, who are not remunerated. This work is carried out through a multitude of associations and community organizations that function as the ultimate safety net for the most vulnerable in the society. They take care of those who are hungry, homeless, who have mental health problems, suffer family violence, etc. In short, those whose basic needs are not insured by government services. These volunteers take care of social solidarity. During and after the confinement period, most of this solidarity work on the ground was slowed down since majority of volunteers are at high risk age group for complication of COVID. The most vulnerable in the society have become yet more vulnerable. But the pandemic also boosts donation and mobilization of large charitable organizations in support of many social and cultural activities. The art and culture sector has indeed been devastated by the pandemic. The entertainment industry has accelerated the online consumption, film, music, video games, Netflix and Spotify, via different internet platforms that often fee basis. The trend among government of rich countries of disinvesting in the field of art and cultures has already begun a decade ago in favor of cultural industry. Government have closed museum, theater, concert hall, cinema, municipal libraries. Several governments have given out subsidies to support artistic performance online or maintain certain activities in official cultural organizations like National Museum. But since the start of the pandemic, the cultural sector, and of course its creators, have become economically vulnerable, while more broadly, certain forms of culture were weakened. With the closing of borders and halting the cultural tourism, the cultural sector is frozen from exhibition to large-scale festivals. The globalization of cultural activity has near dried up, with three risks for the future: going from an overabundance into decline, slipping from modesty toward the lowest quality, and falling into nationalism, losing sight of international cooperation. Again, it seems overall that technological choices have guided political decision-making. Access to culture is available via the internet. But one needs to access to digital tools and a minimum of digital literacy. The pandemic has forged new social inequalities and accentuated the digital divide through digital solutions applied to a growing number of activities in the society. Last point, vulnerability and democracy. The COVID pandemic has induced a state of emergency to public health in numerous countries that have suspended certain basic rights and a significant number of public liberties and fundamental rights, starting with freedom to move and to gather. This, for Western democracy, is an unprecedented shock, which shake both their pillar, capitalism and liberalism. In the context of this crisis, even in Western democracy, there's a fascination with authoritarian power embodied by the head of a state, while surrounded by a group of experts who reassure the people by indicating the way out of this crisis. Is this reaffirmation of the state authority? In any case, this top-down direction of power during the crisis is more pronounced, with an authoritarian drift everywhere in government structures. The pandemic has, however, generating a lasting state of emergency in most democratic countries that has not fallen into totalitarianism. Even so, in several English-speaking countries, especially the United States, tension between public safety and civil liberties were expressed in a very specific context of the recent American presidential elections. Does social media participate in democratic debate by enabling people to express themselves? Are they a democratic space? Or on the contrary, do they create false debate, relay fake news, leading to a degradation in interaction, even a form of violence in our social relations? While misinformation about the pandemic had increased over time, especially on social media, citizen interest in traditional media, newspaper and television, and its informative content increased in Europe and United States. It is perhaps too soon to assess whether COVID crisis has made state and their democratic institutions more vulnerable. Nevertheless, it is clear that the pandemic put them on the test and that governmental solutions have tended toward technological solutions, often issued in an authoritarian fashion in a way that neglect concrete circumstances and discussion on the ground. This general context has created or boosted forms of political protest that directly attack the functioning of democracy by incitating chaos, false information about masks, vaccine, etc., or fooling racism and fear of others in movement of the far right. This trend could lead to a new global authoritarianism with characteristic of nationalist deglobalization, a decline in democratic participation leading to a more state centralization, a digital surveillance state, and erosion of human rights, and finally, a blindness to inequality. Despite this grim scenario, nothing appears to be given in advance. For example, other forms of political collaboration has full record participation in the United States presidential elections. In short, each country may at a later time assess their strengths and weaknesses in its democratic institution with all the analysis and nuance required. Conclusion. Back to the initial question, has the pandemic that revealed the vulnerability of modern technical civilization? We have attempted to answer this on two counts. First, we have illustrated in many examples that the pandemic has brought to the surface many vulnerabilities that was already present in Western society, such as that of the elderly and sick in long-term care facility, and has shown many known inequality and injustice, such as the work-family balance, especially where women are concerned, and the undervalued work of healthcare attendants, who are often immigrants. This vulnerability in connection with activity of taking care has been exacerbated during the pandemic. And these were things that care theories had already identified at the outset. We have also shown that vulnerability applies at a systemic level in various domains and activity in societies. Some of these activities were already undergoing change, such as the globalized production of medical equipment, the field of art and culture, and the hospital system, or under tension, such as university, the workplace, and animal production. This systemic vulnerability shows up as soon as government opt for technological solutions, especially online ones, to maintain the economic system at any cost and manage the crisis. The richest nations have accordingly fooled the technological system and its logic of efficiency. These technological solutions have, among other things, short-circuited human care relations that are specific to this domain: the meaning of work, the student-teacher relation, creative exchange, the helping relationship. Such dehumanization brought about by digital distancing or digitized social activities only multiplies the form of individual vulnerabilities and generate exclusion for many. Instances of protestation at the political level and on social media have polarized the political landscape and put democracy in some doubting dilemmas. While the pandemic has revealed the fragility of modern technological civilization, it has also shown that this civilization still possesses the ability to establish new technological trajectory in order to rationally manage the crisis. But to what point and at what cost? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Parizeau, for a very rich and multi-layered talk. There's much to process and analyze when it comes to COVID and the impact on our lives. I'm going to continue this kind of conversation by asking our audience here if they have any questions. You can raise your hands. I think I have one hand raised here. Yes. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Professor Parizeau, thank you for this very valuable talk. Thank you very much indeed. I was very happy that you started your talk with the ethic of care, and I think it was the continuous thread throughout your talk. And of course, it has been central to feminist philosophy. And I think the challenge I would like to see carried out is all what you explained and all what we have experienced in this pandemic is the centrality of this ethic of care. But it seems to me that the new neoliberal system, although acknowledges the value of all what comes with that ethic of care, it is still very resilient and profit-oriented. And yes, we applaud the nurses, but forget about improving their work conditions, their pay. You spoke about invisibility. So this essential care work that mostly women produce continues to remain invisible. And so the question is twofold. Would this pandemic really impact or push towards more recognition for this ethic of care, or will it really resist it even through some lip service to it? And once the pandemic overcome, how how more savagely will we fall into that neoliberal non-ethic of care kind of system? And perhaps it is not an anecdote that the countries that best managed the pandemic had women at their head. Germany, New Zealand. So what chances do you see for this ethic of care? And thank you.
Thank you for your question. To be very honest, I don't know. For me, it's not easy to have an idea of what will get out of this crisis, because as I try to explain, there's a tension between the necessity of care into society. It's at the bottom, it's foundational, and on the other side, in the modern society is absolutely construct with technology and this logic of liberalism, capitalism, and those two systems are in a way incompatible. So I must say, I don't know what will happen, but I hope that we will take some lesson of this pandemic in recognizing the importance of care and the ethic of care. But I'm not so optimistic about this.
You can raise your hands إذا ممكن تكبسوا على زر الإيد المرفوعة هون، لأنه ما أقدر أشوف الجميع. All right, maybe I can pitch in and ask a question.
I think there's a question.
Oh, there is. Where? Right. Malika? Tfadali.
Yes, I have a bad English. I ask you if can I speak in French?
Oh yes, of course, no problem.
Thank you very much. Donc, je suis Malika Guedim, je suis chercheur à l'Université de Lorraine, Metz en France, et j'étais très honorée de vous écouter depuis la matinée, entre autres vous, professeur. Donc, ma question, elle est entre, je voulais savoir pourquoi vous avez coordonné entre la vulnérabilité et la démocratie dans ce concept pandémique qui est le corona, la Covid-19. Merci, professeur. But you can answer in English. I understood.
Okay,
I understand. No problem.
Okay, the question is about the relation between vulnerability and democracy. I think that what I tried to explain is that there was a certain element of important for democracy, especially human rights, that were limited by states during the pandemic. So I will give you an example. In Quebec, it's the first time that we have the obligation to not to get out of our house at 8 o'clock at night. This is historically something that is completely new for everyone, every citizen, and there's been some discussion about the legitimacy of this choice of the government. So, of course, I think that the pandemic is, of course, something that is completely new and disturbing for the government. But one can see that the space of discussion has been completely impacted by fake news about the vaccine, about the treatment of COVID. So there's some question about the capacity of democracy to still be able to continue their aim, their political aim after the pandemic. And some are asking whether the state, the democratic state, will continue or not this authoritarian trend. So I think when we talk about the fragility or the vulnerability of democracy, I think it's about the fact that our institutions are more fragile than we think. And the example of the presidential election, I think for many countries, especially in Canada, we're just neighbor of the United States. So we're just always looking at what's going on in the United States. What happened in the United States was, I think, a shock for many Western democracy. So I think vulnerability here is about how the state can be transformed and the democracy can be transformed by this use of means that are that can limit the liberties of people and that can fragilize political institutions.
أي أسئلة أخرى؟
Merci beaucoup.
نعم، عندي سؤال. دكتور محمد، تفضل.
Yeah, my question is to which extent, first, thank you very much for this lecture, but my question is about the possibility of reviewing, let me say, dealing with history in the form of holistic approach. Do you think that this pandemic would eventually lead to a possibility of rethinking of dealing with some methodological problems in history? This is one. The other question is to which possibility, as we know from history, that many, let me say, countries or states usually hide the information for the people. And the question is, even in the Western countries, to which extent are really information are hidden for people? So this is in general my question. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your questions. I think I'm unable to respond to your first question. I'm sorry. I have to think about it, but for me, it's not an easy question. So I'll try to answer to the second one. I think that the fact that in Western countries, what happened is that many people that were working had to work in the mediatization of a computer or of some informatic devices. We have mediate more and more our relationship. That's what we can see in the work, in caregiving even. I'm sure that you have in mind many situations where people lost their parents, one of their parents during the COVID pandemic, and they couldn't be with their dying parents. So it's a very, very strange situation where technology is always mediating our relationship, or more and more. So even the information, I think, is in the same situation. What I mean is that we are more and more invaded by lots of information. So people tend to eliminate or choose some sources of informations, and then I think what is really astonishing is how fake news can circulate so easily. So it gives the impression that some facts are hidden, as what you said. But I think I wonder if it's volunteer by states, for example. I think I would have the example of Canada and Quebec. Here we have some politician you have the feeling that they just have no clue about how to manage the crisis. So I think we have to be very careful here between hidden information and the fact that it's a completely new situation where there's no recipes and no political recipes. So in a way, I think that in terms of information, what is really surprising is the fact that people want to be informed, but they don't know how to be informed. And I think there's a difference between information and education also. So, and there's a difference between having information and to judge about this information, and how you have how you validate the information. And I think one of the problems that we have actually with all those news that are, that echoes in the social medias, for example, is that people are anxious about the pandemic, and they don't know, and they try to get information, but they don't know how, and they don't know who to believe, and they don't have the criteria of judgment. One of the problems I was faced with my students is the fact that many people don't have the basic formation in biology to understand what is a vaccine, what is a treatment and they don't understand what's going on because, of course, there's a lot of information. So I would say that it's much more complicated than simply having this idea of hidden information. I think we're facing an ocean of information, and people have problem of getting the right information, the one who's validated, and to try to make his mind about this information.
Okay, I have one hand raised here, Dr. Wuldi.
Oui. نجم نتكلم؟
ايه اسمع تفضل.
Thank you very much, Professeur Marie. My English is not very well, raison pour laquelle je vais vous parler en français. Donc, je vous adresse en français.
تفضل.
Ok. À ce que je pense, vous avez parlé de la technologisation des sociétés modernes. Donc, en philosophie, nous connaissons bien que plusieurs philosophes ont bien renforcé chez toute l'humanité de s'orienter envers la pratique technologique de toutes les connaissances théoriques, dans le sens où que l'humanité se profite bien et belle de cette pratique technologique. Mais malgré ça, de nos jours, nous voyons que presque toutes les sociétés se sont assujetties à une politique mondialisée. Cette politique, à ce que je pense, nous entrave, grosso modo, de se communiquer, nous en tant qu'intellectuels, de se communiquer sur le plan des valeurs universelles. Et pour cette raison que je pense que la philosophie critique nous permet aujourd'hui de chercher quelques issues, comme vous avez parlé déjà auparavant, quelques issues où l'humanité, du moins et précisément ce que Anthony Negri appelle les multitudes résistantes, peuvent-elles trouver quelques issues communs entre eux pour résister contre ce qu'on appelle ce despotisme technologique encouragé bien évidemment de la part des États politiques de tout le monde entier, et je vous remercie.
Can I respond in English, or you prefer that I respond in French?
Yes.
English is okay? Okay.
Yes.
So if I understand well, your question is there any way to resist to this technical system, as Jacques Ellul presented, or this movement of, as you say, despotism, technological despotism, something like this? So if I stick to Ellul analysis, he is very pessimistic. He thinks that there's no way to ameliorate the system. Technological system has its own way of developing, as the autonomy and the fact that it's unity and so on, that I try to explain. So he's very pessimistic in saying that it's a system with this rationality and this efficiency that is at the core of the technical system. And the fact that it's always a technical solution that is always promoted into the technical system. So he says the problem is that there's no way out of this system. He says that the only problem that would arise, that there will be some dysfunction into the system. I think we can see this actually with the rise of internet and the digital system, is that there's more and more cyber attacks. There's more dysfunction that is linked to a way to stop the system and to use it on bad ends, if I can say. But this puts some stress on the system. And during the pandemic, I think many institutions face a lot of cyber attacks. So this means that there's some tension in the digital system, where it creates some imbalance. And Ellul says that in this technical system, there will be some tension of disorder, and this will create some problems that will lower the pressure of the technological system. This means that inside the technological system, there are forces that tend to limit the system, because it's inside itself the logic of the technological system. I don't know if I'm clear enough, but so that's the idea of inside the technological system. But outside the technological system, especially that there's many countries that are not highly technologized because they are poor countries, for example. So of course their way of dealing with technology is different, and there's a lot of I would say in environmental ethics especially, well, philosopher, but also scientists that say, well, there's other options. We can have low technology. We can choose different technological path. We can balance the fact that the capitalistic system is always using technology to expand itself. So there's way to question and to orient differently the technological system. But to be very honest, Jacques Ellul is very pessimistic. He says that there's no way to control the system. And I think one of the lesson of the pandemic is that the system has its own logic, and the technological system has its own logic and can expand itself, but to a certain point. And we can see that there's a cost to this. And that's what I tried to explain in my presentation.
Any other questions? Okay, I'll take advantage of my position for this question. You mentioned misinformation about the pandemic and how it has increased, and that's true. But at the same time, as if science came to the forefront as something to trust, at the same time that you have misinformation about the pandemic. I mean, if you take the case even of Doug Ford in Ontario, he became popular during the pandemic because he was showing that, he believes statistics, he believes, in evidence about the pandemic. He looked tough in terms of how to manage this, but a reason for his popularity is he showed that he believed in science. But I think kind of across the board, globally, you had the feeling that science is needed. And regardless of misinformation or lack of information, people were looking for evidence in terms of how to understand the pandemic and how to treat it. So I think, I agree with you in terms of all the currents we've been seeing with the pandemic, but there are kind of different flows within at the same time. For example, you mentioned how the educational system has suffered. As far as I know, Canadian universities somehow are doing well. And while some American universities are not doing at all, they may shut down. So, there's the debate about the private and the public. Many people are returning to university because they lost their jobs. And at the same time, the pandemic has given opportunities to create infrastructures that didn't exist before. Here, for example, at the Doha Institute, we're into hybrid teaching now, and that has allowed us to increase kind of reliance on technology or build it in a different way as well. So I'm just here looking at, as I said, different trends that may be countercurrent to other trends that you've mentioned.
Yes, you're right in saying that there's other trends. The purpose of my lecture was to put light on the vulnerabilities. That was the idea, because I think it's a good opportunity to highlight those structural or individual in vulnerabilities. Concerning science, I think I didn't explore this in my presentation, but the ways the science evidence has been used and misused by the politics is quite amazing, because you can see how President Trump didn't use science, and on for example, about the treatment of COVID, or about the sanitary measure, for example. And another way, you can see that in other countries, for example, in Germany or in Australia, there have been quite a good way of informing people about what we know actually what the science know actually about COVID, because we can see that our knowledge about the virus evolved during the last 9 months. The way we treat COVID now is much more efficient than we treated at the very beginning of the pandemic, because we didn't know how to treat it. So I think people understood that science is a process. When it's new, it's a process, and that scientists have this way of working, that they test hypotheses, and sometimes well, it's wrong. Their hypothesis is wrong. So they will advance a certain idea, and then it will discuss, and then, well, it will be dropped. But I think for many people, they're not aware of how science construct their evidence. So I think this has been used by politicians to convince sometimes the population to use I would say I'm sorry, I'm searching for my English word, actually. I think government have used science and public health proposition when it was useful for them also. Mm. So especially for the mask and the shutdown of certain activities and so on. So of course there's it's not, we have to deepen and to dig into those issues much more. What I tried to show is that really vulnerability has been, some of the social vulnerability that we know they exist has been under the light, under the spotlight, and we cannot escape those vulnerability during the pandemic. That wasn't my main point, and the fact that the technical choices for government are related to this conception of the technical system, where you're always thinking of technical solutions. And I'm not sure that many of the solutions that have been taken are necessarily good solutions, or the more ethical solutions that could be used in many situations. For example, you were talking about universities. Well, I think it's what we had is no debate on the choice at the university. Professor and student, we didn't give a word about what is happening actually in our university in Quebec, in Canada. We just obey. This is not the usual way where university are run. It's very impressive the way decisions have been taken without any consent with students or professors. This for me is a very good example of a kind of administrative rationality of efficiency and a kind of discourse where in our university, well, the authorities say, well, online courses, it's the same that in presence courses. I'm sorry, it's not the same. And I think this has to be discussed and not only imposed. And in Quebec, for example, was only one university who decided to maintain the course on the campus with physical distanciation and so on, and it worked. So this means that there's alternative. But what amazed me is the uniformity of the technical choice, especially in university. I don't say that it's everything is bad, but there has been no discussion, no democracy inside university, and well, university it's student and professor, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's what you mentioned, the tendency to become less democratic in this whole process, highlight, the technical aspects, the bureaucracy itself, etc. I mean, certainly, and that's, I think, that's one aspect of your talk, is how all these things are multi-layered and interconnected at the same time. You can't separate them. We have one question through social media. I'm going to read it as is without any formatting or editing. Don't you think that the vulnerabilities surfaced during the pandemic are socioeconomic impacts of the fragile economic system in the democratic countries, because the so-called social justice and equality in reality are far away from the ideal discourse of democracy? The system still works with the same old rule. The wheel will smash the weak first. That comes as a question.
I'm sorry, can you summarize the question, because I'm not sure I understood.
So I think the main statement is that, or the question is, don't you think that the vulnerabilities we saw surfacing during the pandemic have kind of shown the fragility of the economic system in the democratic countries? And then this is related to kind of, that the social justice and equality are not somehow connected to the discourse of democracy. So that's why I wanted to read it as first, to see what's not understood in it. So I think it's, kind of, there's the discourse of democracy, and there's how democracy misfunctions when it comes to social justice and equality, and the relationship between socioeconomic, I think, vulnerabilities and the fragile economic system that can be, or that belongs to certain democratic countries. So, I think you've mentioned some of these issues, but if you'd like to address.
Well, I will just add a word. I think what is interesting with ethic of care is essentially to link democracy to the question of justice. And I think the comment shows exactly one of the tension that we have actually with our democratic institution and discourse, that is more shaped by the economic system and the neoliberalism that is still at the world level, and the aspiration inside democracy, which is not only autonomy and liberty, but also justice. So I think we have actually some aspiration of justice. And why I choose the ethic of care is because they give tools to identify, I think, profound injustice in society, and means to get out of those injustice.
Any other questions? This is your last chance. I don't see any hands raised. I'll wait for a second. Okay, Muhammad, please go ahead.
Yeah, my question is about the possibilities of changing values in the society as an influence of the pandemic. We know that behavior is changing. As we know, Western society, we have in Germany, this is the individual society, that things are changing. The state is, controlling everything. And the other side, Arabic countries, we have a problem of the behavior of people. They want to pray. This is the collective. They want to have the wedding with thousands and so on. I think this is, I don't know what you think about changing of such values in society as an influence of this pandemic, corona pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I appreciate the comparison. I think, of course, my presentation was, of course, a reflection about what I know, which is, of course, the Western countries. And I didn't want to make any comparison because this means that you need to know deeply the other countries that are not Western countries to make sound comparison. So I would again talk from where I am, Western countries. You're right in saying that there's some values that are changing. I think there's behaviors that are changing, but I don't know if it will last. That's my question, because I can see that the people are at home at work. So in my neighborhood, just for example, I can see that how people are walking around, which is fantastic. This means that they're changing their way of living, but this will last. During the summer, people will be much more, will try to support local economy, so they will buy local products. Okay, good. Will this last? So there's a lot of question here where I wonder if those changes are profound value choice or simply kind of experimentation, and well, they're trying to be consistent a little bit with their new way of life. So hopefully those value will stay and there will be some changes, but I'm still questioning our relation to the politics. And this for me is a profound question, because I think we have been mainly in democratic society, citizens have been very passive during all the pandemic. They have just act as the government ask, but there's no reaction really. Only a few manifestation, but the majority of people as just passive citizens. So I wonder if in terms of democratic value, if we learn something. Thank you.
Well, I guess there's so much to learn with time in terms of what this pandemic has done to our societies, to our values, to our systems. I think this is just the beginning of the discussion on COVID-19. I want to thank you immensely, Professor Marie-Hélène Parizeau. It has been a pleasure to listen to you and to hear the discussion, the answers, the questions, the passion in terms of trying to understand the moment we're living. By the way, I could see the Canadian academic tone as well in your talk in terms of specific ethos we carry with us all the time when we discuss societies, democracies, etc. Thank you again. نشكر الحضور معنا هون على السوشيال ميديا، وكمان نشكر تحديدا الزميل إبراهيم عبد الجواد على مجهود الكبير معنا في إنجاح هذه الندوة وكل الندوات، كل الزملاء والأعزاء عامر، نغم، معتز، أحمد، حسين. كما أشكر الأساتذة الأفاضل الذين شاركوا معنا في الندوة، رشيد بطيب، مشير باسيل عون، عادل حجامي، زواوي بهورة، معتز الخطيب، المودي عز ديني، محمد مرقتن، الدكتور طبعا يعني مكرم دكتورة ماري-هيلين باريزو. أنوه أن الأوراق ستنشر قريبا في عدد خاص بالفلسفة والمرض والجائحة، وسيصدر العدد منتصف شهر فبراير. Thank you again for being with us. We hope to see you another time and in the near future. Bye-bye.